The smoke from the cigar curled upward like a question mark, dissipating into the velvet darkness of the private booth. Kang Dae-sung didn't smoke often anymore, doctor's orders, but tonight was different. Tonight marked 7 years since the world had folded in on itself and left him standing in the wreckage, breathing but not quite alive. The lounge at the Azure Pearl was Seoul's worst-kept secret, a place where power brokers traded favors over aged whiskey, and the city's elite pretended not to recognize each other. It was a Monday, which meant the space hummed with the particular energy of people trying to forget they had jobs to return to in the morning. Dae-sung occupied a corner booth designed for privacy, its leather seats worn smooth by decades of clandestine meetings. He was 44, his frame still commanding despite the years, wearing a charcoal suit that whispered money rather than shouted it. To the servers who moved like shadows through the dim lighting, he was simply Mr. Kong, a businessman whose exact business no one dared to question too closely. To those who truly knew, he was something far more dangerous. A man whose word could restructure entire districts, whose disapproval could end careers, and whose silence often preceded violence. He glanced at his phone, the screen's blue glow illuminating features that had been carved by loss into something harder than they should have been. 7 years. He'd been sitting in variations of this same booth for 7 years, observing the world from behind bulletproof glass and emotional barriers that nothing seemed capable of penetrating. The booth could seat 6 comfortably. He always reserved the entire thing. A territorial assertion that also served as a monument to his isolation. He lifted the glass of whiskey neat room temperature, the way his father had taught him before everything went sideways. That's when his peripheral vision caught movement, rapid and purposeful in a space designed for languid indulgence. 2 figures materialized at the edge of his table, moving with the kind of synchronized precision that made his security instincts flare. They were children, identical twin girls who couldn't have been older than 9, both black, both wearing matching purple hoodies over white dresses that looked expensive but slightly rumpled. Their hair was styled in identical braided crowns, and they carried themselves with a confidence that seemed absurd given their surroundings. Dae-sung froze, the glass halfway to his lips. In his world, children were collateral damage to be avoided, bargaining chips in the worst negotiations, never participants. He slowly set the glass down with a controlled precision that belied his confusion. The girl on the right stepped forward first, her small hands pressing against the polished wood table as she leaned in with an intensity that would have been comical if not for the genuine urgency in her eyes. The girl on the left mirrored the position exactly, their movements so synchronized they could have been reflections. They both scanned the lounge quickly, checking exits and observers with a practiced awareness that raised every red flag in Dae-sung's tactical mind. "You need to be our father," the right twin whispered, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested this wasn't a request. "Right now. No questions." Dae-sung's expression didn't change, though internally he was recalibrating every assumption about how this evening would unfold. "Excuse me." His voice came out like gravel, rough from disuse in social contexts. "Just for 30 minutes, the left twin added quickly, her eyes darting toward the entrance. "There's a security guard who keeps trying to kick us out because we don't have adults. He's coming back any second and he's got that radio thing and we can't get caught here alone again." Dae-sung followed their gaze to see a burly security guard with a tablet and an officious expression beginning another sweep of the lounge, clearly searching for something. Or someone. He returned his attention to the girls. "I am not what one would call approachable," Dae-sung said flatly, gesturing vaguely to his entire presence, his obvious Korean heritage, the scar that traced his left cheekbone, the aura of controlled menace that kept most people at a respectful distance. The right twin actually rolled her eyes, a gesture of such pure exasperation it caught him completely off guard. "We're obviously adopted in this story. Just go with it. Please. We're desperate here." There was something in that please that bypassed all his defenses. It wasn't begging. It was negotiation. It was the sound of someone cornered but refusing to break. A sound Dae-sung recognized from his own reflection. He felt something shift in his chest, a tiny crack in the permafrost that had settled there 7 years ago. He looked at the empty seats surrounding him. He looked at these two girls who were practically vibrating with nervous energy but holding their ground with impressive resolve. 30 minutes, Dae-sung said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble that suggested this was now their shared secret. Sit. Quickly. The twins scrambled into the booth just as the security guard rounded the bar, his tablet raised like a weapon of bureaucratic authority. His eyes locked onto the girls and his jaw set with the determination of someone who'd found his target. There you two are, the guard said, his voice carrying across the lounge loud enough to draw glances. I told you before, this establishment has a strict policy about unaccompanied minors. You can't just wander around luxury venues without adult supervision. This isn't a playground. He approached the table with heavy footsteps, clearly enjoying his moment of authority. Then Dae-sung slowly turned his head. He didn't speak immediately. He simply directed the full weight of his attention toward the guard, a look that had stopped armed men in their tracks and ended territorial disputes without a single word being exchanged. The guard's confident stride faltered like he'd hit an invisible wall. Is there a problem? Dae-sung asked, each syllable precisely enunciated, carrying a threat that had nothing to do with volume. The guard's hand tightened on his tablet, his earlier confidence evaporating. I wasn't aware these children were with a guest, mister. He trailed off, clearly hoping for a name he could use to verify the situation. Dae-sung didn't provide one. Instead, he turned to the girls. Tyla, he said, picking a name that felt right for reasons he couldn't articulate. Were you wandering? Both girls shook their heads in perfect synchronization, their eyes going wide with practiced innocence. No, Dad, the right one said, the word sliding out smoothly like they'd been using it for years. We were just looking for you. This place is like a maze. We got a little turned around. The left one nodded vigorously. We thought you were at the other table, but then we found you here. Sorry we worried you. Dae-sung returned his gaze to the guard, and this time there was something almost predatory in the set of his jaw. They were looking for me. Now they have found me. You may return to your duties. The dismissal was absolute, delivered with the kind of finality that made it clear any further conversation would be a mistake. The guard flushed, stammered something that might have been an apology, and retreated with considerably less confidence than he'd approached. As soon as he was out of earshot, both girls exhaled simultaneously, their shoulders dropping as the tension left their small frames. They looked at each other, then at Dae-sung, and identical grins spread across their faces. Okay, that was genuinely terrifying, the right twin said with undisguised admiration. Like, I felt scared and I was on your team. Do you practice that in a mirror, or is it just natural? I'm Tyla, the left one added quickly, extending a small hand across the table with surprising formality. And this is also Tyla. We're both Tyla. Our mom thought it was funny. She was wrong, but we're stuck with it now. Dae-sung felt the corner of his mouth twitch, an unfamiliar sensation. That seemed strategically problematic for daily operations. Tell us about it, right, Tyla said, rolling her eyes again. We go by Tyla 1 and Tyla 2, but only at home. In public we just confuse everyone and it's honestly kind of great. I can see the advantage in controlled chaos, Dae-sung admitted, surprising himself with the observation. Before we continue with what happens next, if you're enjoying this story of unexpected family and second chances, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This channel brings you deeply emotional narratives about love, redemption, and the families we choose, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. The way these twins transform this dangerous man's life will absolutely break your heart and put it back together again. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's get back to the story because things are about to get even more interesting. The relief at the table was palpable, but it lasted exactly 12 seconds. The sound of heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor announced a new arrival, and Dae-sung's tactical awareness kicked into overdrive. He shifted his gaze to track the source of the sound. A woman was cutting through the lounge with the kind of barely contained panic that suggested she was operating on pure adrenaline. She was black, beautiful in an understated way that suggested she had neither the time nor the energy to care about appearances, wearing jeans and a blazer that had seen better days. Her natural hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, and she carried herself with the exhausted dignity of someone who'd been running on fumes for far too long. This, Dae-sung concluded, was the mother. She spotted the twins and her entire body seemed to collapse inward with relief, only to immediately tense again when she registered where they were sitting and who they were sitting with. She slowed her approach, wariness replacing panic as she took in the scene. Her eyes moved from her daughters to the sharply dressed stranger to the clearly expensive booth to the remains of a cigar still smoldering in the ashtray. "Girls," she said, her voice breathless but controlled. "I told you to wait by the fountain in the lobby, while I dealt with the parking situation. You promised me you'd stay put. Do you have any idea how terrified I was?" Both Tylas had the decency to look genuinely guilty, their earlier confidence evaporating under their mother's gaze. "We're sorry, Mom," Tyla once said quietly, but the security guard was being really aggressive about the no kids without parents rule, and we didn't want to get you in trouble, so we found a temporary dad. "A very convincing one," Tyla too added helpfully. "He's got the scary thing down to a science." The guard practically ran away. The mother, whose name Dae-sung didn't yet know, stopped at the edge of the table. She was gripping her purse strap so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She looked at Dae-sung directly, and he saw something in her eyes he recognized, the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. "I am so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. They have very active imaginations and clearly no sense of appropriate boundaries. "Girls, get up right now. We're leaving this gentleman alone. I'm sure he has very important business to attend to." Dae-sung set his glass down carefully. He looked at the woman, taking in the frayed edge of her blazer sleeve and the way her hands were trembling slightly despite her composed exterior. He looked at the empty seats that had been mocking him for 7 years. He looked at the twins who were looking at him with an expression that was part hope, part challenge. He didn't want to return to being the man alone in the booth for 6. He didn't want the silence to settle back over him like a burial shroud. "They are not bothering me," Dae-sung said, standing up in one fluid motion. He buttoned his suit jacket, a gesture that somehow made him look both more formal and more approachable. "In fact, I believe we were about to order dessert. Please join us." The woman hesitated, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Sir, I really can't impose like this. This place is, well, it's extremely expensive and you clearly came here for privacy and we've already disrupted your evening enough and—" "I came here for nothing," Dae-sung interrupted gently, the honesty of it surprising even himself. "And it is already paid for. It would be inefficient to waste the reservation. Please, sit." The twins were practically bouncing in their seats, their eyes moving between their mother and Dae-sung like they were watching a tennis match. The woman, still standing, looked at her daughters, then at Dae-sung, then at the opulent booth that probably cost more to reserve than she made in a week. "I'm Keisha," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "And I promise we'll only stay for a little while. The girls have school tomorrow and it's already past their bedtime and—" "Keisha," Dae-sung repeated, committing it to memory. "Sit. We will order. They will eat. You will stop apologizing. This is the arrangement." It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't a command. It was something in between, an offer extended from someone who'd forgotten how to make them. Keisha sat. What followed was the strangest 30 minutes of Dae-sung's life, and he'd once negotiated a hostage release using only hand signals and a bottle of soju. The twins, he discovered, were terrifyingly intelligent. They debated the merits of various desserts with the kind of strategic thinking he employed in business acquisitions. They asked him questions about his job, with an innocence that suggested they hadn't quite connected the dots about what kind of man wore a suit that expensive to a lounge on a Monday night. "So what do you do?" Tyla too asked around a mouthful of chocolate cake. "Besides being scary on demand." "I manage resources," Dae-sung said carefully, which was technically true. "I ensure that agreements are honored and that territorial boundaries are respected." "Like a referee?" Tyla one asked. "Of a sort," Dae-sung agreed. Though the penalties for rule violations are somewhat more severe. Keisha choked slightly on her water. The twins, meanwhile, seemed to find this fascinating. They peppered him with questions about negotiation tactics, about how to read people, about the importance of reputation. Dae-sung found himself answering with a candor that would have horrified his associates. There was something about their genuine curiosity that bypassed his usual filters. Keisha watched this exchange with a mixture of amusement and growing concern, clearly trying to figure out exactly what kind of man her daughters had adopted as a temporary father figure. "You're very patient with them," she observed quietly while the twins debated whether to order a second dessert. "They're intelligent," Dae-sung replied. "Intelligence deserves engagement, not patronizing. Most people just tell them to be quiet and sit still. Most people are idiots." Keisha laughed, a genuine sound that lit up her entire face. "You say that like it's a statistical fact. In my experience, it is." The 30 minutes stretched to 45, then an hour. Dae-sung found himself ordering coffee, then ordering the twins hot chocolate when they made persuasive arguments about the injustice of being excluded from the beverage selection. He watched Keisha slowly relax, her shoulders dropping, her smile coming easier. When she mentioned she was between jobs, he didn't offer sympathy. When she talked about the challenges of raising twins alone, he didn't offer platitudes. He simply listened with the full attention he usually reserved for analyzing enemy positions. "What brought you here tonight?" he asked eventually. "To this specific location, I mean. It's not exactly on the standard tourist route." Keisha's smile turned rueful. "The girls have been obsessed with this place since they saw it in some movie. They saved their allowance for 3 months to buy me dinner here as an early birthday present. I tried to explain that their savings wouldn't cover even the appetizers, but they were so determined and I couldn't bear to disappoint them. I figured we'd come, look around, maybe get one dessert to share and leave. I didn't account for the aggressive security protocols." She looked at her daughters with such naked love it made something in Dae-sung's chest ache. "They're everything to me," she said simply. "I know I'm supposed to have my own identity and ambitions beyond motherhood, but honestly, they're the best thing I've ever done. The only thing that really matters." Dae-sung felt the weight of her words settle over him. 7 years ago, he'd lost his wife and daughter in a car accident that had been meant for him. 7 years of existing in the margins, of going through the motions, of forgetting what it felt like to be tethered to something beyond obligation and revenge. "That is not a failing," he said quietly. "That is clarity." When the evening finally ended and Keisha managed to corral her daughters toward the exit, both twins turned back to look at him. "Thank you for being our dad tonight," Tyla 1 said seriously. "You were really good at it," Tyla 2 added. "Like surprisingly good. You should consider doing it professionally." Before Dae-sung could formulate a response, Keisha shepherded them toward the door. But she paused, turning back with an expression that was part gratitude, part curiosity. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Kong Dae-sung," he replied, and then did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He pulled out a business card, one that listed only his name and a phone number. "If you or the twins ever need anything, or if they want to debate dessert strategy again, the offer is open." Keisha took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Why?" she asked simply. Dae-sung looked at the booth, at the seats that were now rumpled and marked by the presence of others, at the empty plates that proved the evening had been real. "Because I forgot what it felt like to be part of something," he said. "And they reminded me." After they left, Dae-sung sat back down in the booth. The silence that returned wasn't the same comfortable emptiness he'd cultivated for 7 years. It felt wrong now, hollow in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. He looked at the card Keisha had left behind, propped up against his glass. It was a simple business card with her name and a phone number written in neat handwriting. He hadn't noticed her leaving it. He pocketed it carefully, finished his drink, and left the azure pearl with the strange sensation that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully controlled universe. He was right to be concerned. 3 days later, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize but had memorized nonetheless. Dae-sung. Keisha's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I know this is completely inappropriate and I have no right to ask, but I don't know who else to call. One of the girls, Tyla too, she's been running a fever and I took her to the clinic but they want to do tests and they're talking about the hospital and my insurance is, well, it's complicated right now and I'm trying to figure out payment plans but they're saying it could be serious and I don't. Which hospital? Dae-sung interrupted, already standing up from his desk, already reaching for his coat. St. Michael's, but really I shouldn't have called, I'll figure something. I am 10 minutes away. Do not speak to anyone about payment until I arrive. Do you understand? There was a pause. Dae-sung, I can't ask you to. You are not asking. I am telling. 10 minutes. He hung up before she could protest further. He looked at his assistant, who was staring at him with undisguised shock. Cancel the rest of my day, Dae-sung said. Reschedule everything. But sir, the park negotiation is this afternoon. We've been planning this for 3 months. If you're not there, I have more important matters to attend to, Dae-sung said flatly. My daughter is in the hospital. The lie came out so smoothly it didn't even feel like deception. His assistant's eyes widened. I didn't know you had a daughter, sir. Neither did I, Dae-sung muttered, already heading for the elevator. Until very recently. When he arrived at St. Michael's, he didn't just bring his wallet. He brought the full force of his influence. The hospital emergency room was chaos incarnate, a fluorescent-lit purgatory where time moved differently and suffering was measured in plastic wristbands and triage numbers. Dae-sung cut through it like a blade. His presence parting the crowd of waiting patients and harried staff with the efficiency of someone who was used to bending reality to his will. He found Keisha in a corner of the waiting area, hunched over in a plastic chair that looked like it had been designed as a form of punishment. Tyla One sat beside her, holding her mother's hand with a fierce protectiveness that made her look older than her 9 years. When they saw him, both their faces transformed with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. You came, Keisha said, and there was wonder in her voice, like she genuinely hadn't believed he would show up. I said I would, Dae-sung replied, and then he did something that surprised even himself. He knelt down in front of Tyla One, bringing himself to her eye level. How are you holding up? I'm scared, she admitted, her voice small. Tyla too was really hot, and she said her stomach hurt a lot, and then she threw up in the car and Mom was trying to drive and help her at the same time and it was really bad. She is going to be fine, Dae-sung said with absolute certainty. I am going to make sure of it. Do you trust me? Tyla One looked at him with those wise, too-old eyes. Yes, she said simply. He stood up and turned his attention to the situation at hand. Within 20 minutes, through a combination of strategic phone calls, implied threats, and the kind of money that made bureaucratic obstacles evaporate, Tyla too had been moved to a private room on the pediatric floor. A specialist had been consulted, not just any specialist but the head of pediatric medicine who happened to owe Dae-sung a favor from a situation neither of them discussed in polite company. The diagnosis, when it came, was appendicitis. Caught early enough that surgery would be routine, but serious enough that Keisha's decision to bring her in immediately had potentially prevented a much worse situation. Dae-sung stood outside the operating room, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. Keisha sat in a chair a few feet away, Tyla One curled up against her side. They'd been waiting for 45 minutes. Surgery for a child, even routine surgery, was never truly routine when it was your child on the table. Tell me about them, Dae-sung said suddenly, breaking the silence. Keisha looked up confused. About who? Your family. The one you lost. The ones who made you into this man who sits alone in expensive booths and radiates danger like it's your personal climate. Dae-sung opened his eyes but didn't look at her. He stared at the opposite wall, at a cheerful mural of cartoon animals that was probably meant to comfort children, but just felt aggressively inappropriate, given the circumstances. My wife was Yoon SEO, he said quietly. She was an artist. Terrible at business, brilliant at seeing beauty in things most people overlooked. She used to sketch on napkins when we went to restaurants these little drawings of the people around us. I still have boxes of napkins in my apartment that I can't throw away. His voice remained steady, but Keisha could see his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Our daughter was named Hannah. She was 5 years old. She loved purple, refused to eat anything green, and had convinced herself that she could talk to birds. Every morning she would stand on our balcony and have full conversations with the pigeons. I would tell her they couldn't understand her, and she would tell me I just didn't know how to listen properly. What happened? Keisha asked gently. Car accident. 7 years ago. They were on their way to pick me up from a meeting I had scheduled in a location I had chosen. The accident was meant for me. A rival organization trying to send a message. But the intelligence was flawed, the timing was wrong, and instead of killing me, they killed everything that mattered. He finally turned to look at Keisha, and she saw the rawness in his eyes, the wound that had never properly healed. I have spent 7 years making sure everyone involved paid for that mistake. And then I spent the years after that trying to figure out how to exist in a world where they were gone and I was still here. I never found a good answer to that question. Until a couple of kids adopted you as their temporary dad in a fancy lounge, Keisha said. Until that, yes. They sat in silence for a few more minutes before Keisha spoke again. I was married once too, she said. The twins' father. He left when they were 2. Said he wasn't ready for the responsibility. Like they were a hobby he'd gotten bored with rather than actual human beings he'd helped create. I was so angry for so long. But eventually I realized that anger was taking up space that my girls needed. So I let it go and focused on being enough for both of us. Some days I succeed. Some days I fail spectacularly. Today feels like one of the failure days. You got her here in time, Daesung said. You recognized that something was wrong and you acted. That is not failure. I couldn't pay for it, Keisha said, her voice cracking. I brought my daughter to the emergency room, and I couldn't even afford to get her treated without calling a man I barely know and begging for help. What kind of mother does that make me? Daesung crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He knelt down in front of her again, this time placing his hands over hers. It makes you a mother who loves her daughter more than she loves her pride, he said fiercely. It makes you smart enough to ask for help when you need it. It makes you exactly the kind of mother those girls deserve. Keisha looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she'd been too cautious to acknowledge before. This man, this dangerous, complicated, damaged man, was falling for her family just as hard as they were falling for him. The doctor emerged from the surgical suite, and they both stood up so fast they nearly collided. Tyla One woke up with a start, looking around with panicked eyes until she saw the doctor's smile. Everything went perfectly, the doctor said. She's in recovery now. She'll need to stay overnight for observation, but she should be able to go home tomorrow afternoon. You can see her in about 20 minutes once she's moved to her room. The relief was so intense it was almost painful. Keisha's knees actually buckled slightly, and Daesung's hand shot out to steady her. She turned into his chest and started crying, these great heaving sobs that she'd been holding back for hours. He held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist, while Tyla One hugged both of them around the middle. They stood like that for a long time. This improvised family held together by crisis and choice, and Daesung felt something fundamental shift inside him. He'd spent 7 years convinced that caring about people was a liability, that love was a weakness that could be exploited. But standing in that hospital hallway, holding this woman and her daughter while they cried with relief, he realized that maybe the real weakness had been trying to live without it. When they finally pulled apart, Keisha wiped her eyes and laughed shakily. I'm sorry, I just got your very expensive suit all snotty. It is replaceable, Daesung said. You are not. And there it was, out in the open, the truth he'd been circling around for months. Keisha looked up at him, her eyes still red from crying, and said, We should probably talk about what this is. What we are. Yes, Daesung agreed. We should. But perhaps after we ensure both twins are healthy and back home. One crisis at a time. Practical, Keisha said. I am many things, Daesung replied. Practical is usually one of them. When they were finally allowed into Tyla 2's room, she was groggy from anesthesia but awake enough to smile when she saw them. Tyla 1 rushed to her bedside, careful not to jostle her, and immediately started telling her everything she'd missed. Daesung stood by the window watching the city lights, giving them space. But Tyla 2 called out to him, her voice slightly slurred from the medication. Dad! He turned, his heart doing something complicated in his chest at the casual use of the title. Yes. Thanks for coming. Mom said you dropped everything to be here. Of course, Daesung said, moving closer to the bed. Where else would I be? Running your scary empire? Tyla 2 suggested, grinning loopily. Making people tremble with your intimidating presence? That can wait, Daesung said. You are more important. Tyla 2's eyes started to drift closed, but she smiled. You're a good dad, she murmured. We picked well. Keisha watched this exchange, watched this dangerous man gentle himself for her drugged daughter, and knew with absolute certainty that her life had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely better all at once. She didn't know exactly what Daesung did for a living, though she had her suspicions. She didn't know what it would mean to tie her life and her daughter's lives to someone who operated in the shadows. But she knew that he had shown up when they needed him. And right now that was enough. Daesung stayed through the night, dozing in a chair that was absolutely not designed for someone his size, refusing to leave even when Keisha told him to go home and rest. When morning came and Tyla 2 was declared healthy enough to be discharged, he drove them all home in his car, the twins arguing about whether the hospital pudding qualified as breakfast in the back seat. When they pulled up to Keisha's modest apartment building, so far removed from his world of penthouses and private lounges, he helped carry Tyla 2 inside, settled her on the couch with blankets and her favorite stuffed animals, and made sure they had everything they needed. As he prepared to leave, Keisha walked him to the door. Thank you, she said simply. For all of it. You don't need to thank me, Daesung replied. Yes, I do. Because you didn't have to do any of this. We're not your responsibility. He looked at her, his hand on the door frame. No, he agreed. You are not my responsibility, but you are becoming my choice. And that is far more important. He left before she could respond, but the words hung in the air long after he was gone. Within 20 minutes, through a combination of strategic phone calls, implied threats, and the kind of money that made bureaucratic obstacles evaporate, Tyla 2 had been moved to a private room on the pediatric floor. A specialist had been consulted, and Keisha was sitting with a cup of tea that didn't taste like liquefied cardboard. Daesung stood by the window watching the city sprawl below, his tie loosened, feeling more exhausted than he had after closing a multimillion-dollar deal. Tyla 2 was sleeping now, her small hand clutching a stuffed animal that had appeared from somewhere in Keisha's enormous purse. Tyla 1 sat in a chair, swinging her legs, watching Daesung with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging every detail. You called her your daughter, Keisha said softly from her position beside the bed. When you were talking to the administrator. Daesung didn't turn around immediately. He studied his reflection in the dark glass, seeing a man who looked haunted by something other than the past for the first time in years. It was expedient, he said, the excuse weak even to his own ears. It simplified the authorization process. Keisha stood up and crossed to him. She was small compared to his frame, but she moved with a quiet strength that commanded attention. She placed a hand on his arm, and the contact sent a jolt through his system that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with how long it had been since someone had touched him with genuine affection. You're a terrible liar, Daesung, she said quietly. I mean, you're probably a great liar in your actual job, whatever that really is. But right now, you're terrible at it. He turned to face her, and for the first time in 7 years, he let someone see the man beneath the armor. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be what you need, what they need. I am not a good man, Keisha. My life is complicated and dangerous and completely incompatible with stability. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Keisha said. I'm just asking you to be present. The girls, they talk about you constantly. You made an impression. And honestly, so did you. On me. Daesung looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been carrying the weight of the world alone for too long. Someone who'd been told she had to do it all herself, be everything to everyone, never ask for help. Someone who reminded him painfully of himself. What if I'm not capable of this? He asked. What if I'm too broken? Then we'll be broken together, Keisha said simply. Because newsflash, I'm not exactly a poster child for having it all figured out either. Behind them, Tyla once spoke up. Are you two done being emotionally vulnerable? Because Tyla too is going to wake up soon, and she's going to be insufferable about missing this moment. They both turned to see the 9-year-old looking at them with an expression of supreme satisfaction. Also, she continued, if you're going to be our dad for real, we need to establish some ground rules. Like, you can't use the scary voice on our teachers, even if they're being unreasonable. It'll cause problems. Daesung felt something in his chest crack open, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it could thaw. Ground rules, he repeated. Yes, I can work with ground rules. Good, Tyla once said decisively, because we've got a whole list. Tyla too wrote it down. It's very comprehensive. Over the next year, Daesung's life underwent a transformation that terrified his associates and amused the twins to no end. The breakdown of his isolation wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, steady erosion of walls he'd spent 7 years building. It was Wednesday evenings at Keisha's modest apartment, where he learned he was surprisingly good at helping with science projects but absolutely terrible at any video game that required quick reflexes. It was the way his driver started keeping coloring books in the car for unexpected passengers. It was the first time he attended a school event, sitting in the back row of the auditorium for a 4th-grade talent show, watching both Tylas perform a synchronized dance routine they'd been practicing for weeks. The elementary school gymnasium had been transformed into something approximating a theater, with a makeshift stage constructed from risers and curtains that were probably older than most of the students. The audience was a sea of parents clutching phones to document every moment, grandparents who smiled indulgently at everything, and siblings who looked like they'd been forced to attend under threat of losing screen time privileges. Daesung sat in the back row, his frame too large for the folding chair, feeling profoundly out of place among the casual attire and relaxed energy of the other parents. He was wearing a suit, because he'd come directly from a meeting where he'd been negotiating territorial boundaries with a rival organization. The juxtaposition was not lost on him. Keisha found him there, weaving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. She'd saved him a seat closer to the front, but one look at his face told her he was more comfortable maintaining his position at the back, where he could observe everything and be observed by fewer people. You came, she said, sliding into the seat beside him. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual style that made her look younger than her years. I said I would, Daesung replied. Did you doubt me? No, Keisha admitted. But I also know you had that thing today. The important meeting that you couldn't tell me details about, but that involved people I probably don't want to know about. It concluded early, Daesung said, which was technically true. He'd concluded it early by making his position abundantly clear in a way that discouraged further negotiation. The lights dimmed, and a harried-looking teacher took to the stage to welcome everyone and explain the format of the show. There would be 17 acts, ranging from piano solos to magic tricks to a dramatic reading from a book about a dog who learned to skateboard. The twins were act number 12. Daesung sat through the first 11 acts with the intense focus he usually reserved for business presentations. He watched a boy play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on a recorder with more enthusiasm than accuracy. He observed a girl perform a gymnastics routine that was mostly just rolling around on a mat. He witnessed a magic trick that went disastrously wrong when the rabbit refused to cooperate, resulting in a chase scene that the teacher had to intervene in. Through it all, he felt his anxiety building. What if something went wrong? What if the twins forgot their routine? What if other children laughed at them? Keisha must have sensed his tension because she reached over and squeezed his hand, They're going to be fine, she whispered. They're having fun. That's what matters. Then the teacher announced, and now performing a dance routine to their favorite song, please welcome Tyla and Tyla. The twins bounded onto the stage wearing matching outfits they designed themselves, purple and silver, with enough glitter to be visible from space. They took their positions standing back to back, waiting for the music to start. The opening notes began and they started moving. Objectively, it was not a flawless performance. Their timing was slightly off in places, their movements enthusiastic but not entirely coordinated. Tyla 1 spun left when she should have spun right at one point, nearly colliding with her sister. Tyla 2 forgot a step in the middle section and improvised something that didn't quite match the music. But they were committed. They performed with the kind of absolute confidence that only children possess, the unshakable belief that they were nailing it despite all evidence to the contrary. They smiled at each other, helped each other through the rough patches, and finished the routine with a synchronized jump that they actually managed to land at the same time. The audience applauded politely, the standard encouragement given to all the children. Daesung stood up. He started clapping with the intensity that seemed excessive for a fourth-grade talent show. His applause was sharp, loud, impossible to ignore. Other parents turned to look at him, confused by this sudden standing ovation for a routine that had been good but not exceptional. But Daesung didn't care. He kept clapping, his expression serious, his eyes locked on the twins who were now looking at him from the stage with growing grins. Slowly, hesitantly, other parents started to stand. Maybe out of politeness, maybe out of social pressure, maybe because they didn't want to be the only ones still sitting. Within 10 seconds, the entire gymnasium was on its feet, applauding the twins who were now beaming with pride. "You're ridiculous," Keisha said, standing beside him, but she was crying slightly, moved by the gesture. "They worked hard," Daesung said simply. "They deserved recognition." After the show ended and the chaos of pickup began, the twins found them in the parking lot. They were both vibrating with excitement, talking over each other about the performance, about how they'd nailed the jump at the end, about how everyone had stood up for them. "Did you see?" Tyla 1 asked, grabbing Daesung's hand. "Did you see how everyone stood up?" "Everyone stood up because your father practically forced them to with his aggressive applause," Keisha pointed out, but she was smiling. "I regret nothing," Daesung said. "It was a tactical deployment of enthusiasm." "It was embarrassing," Tyla 2 said, but she was grinning from ear to ear. "Like our friends were asking who the scary guy in the suit was and why he was clapping so loud." "What did you tell them?" Daesung asked. "That you're our dad," Tyla 1 said casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "And that you're extra but we love you anyway." Something in Daesung's chest cracked open a little wider. He knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level, not caring that his expensive suit was hitting the dirty parking lot asphalt. "I am very proud of both of you," he said seriously. "Not just for the performance, though that was excellent, but for supporting each other up there. When one of you made a mistake, the other one was right there to help. That is what family does. That is what matters." The twins looked at each other, then back at him, and simultaneously launched themselves at him in a hug that nearly knocked him over. He caught them, held them, and felt Keisha's hand rest gently on his shoulder. Later that night, after they'd dropped the twins at their friend's house for a sleepover they'd been planning for weeks, Keisha and Daesung found themselves alone in his car, parked outside her apartment building. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for making them feel special." "They are special," Daesung replied. "I was simply making sure they knew it." Keisha reached across the console and cupped his face with her hand. "You love them. And you can finally admit it." He turned to look at her, vulnerability clear in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I love them in a way that terrifies me because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love. But I cannot seem to stop myself." "Good," she said simply. "Because they love you too. And so do I." They were objectively not very good, their timing slightly off, their movements enthusiastic but uncoordinated. When they finished, Daesung started a standing ovation that was perhaps overly aggressive for an elementary school gymnasium. Other parents looked at him like he'd lost his mind. He didn't care. After the show, Keisha found him in the parking lot, leaning against his car, looking at the stars. "You made them so happy tonight," she said, sliding her hand into his. They couldn't stop talking about how their dad was the only one who stood up. "They worked hard," Daesung said. "Effort deserves recognition." "Is that what this is?" Keisha asked gently. "Recognition of effort?" He turned to look at her, this woman who'd somehow become the center of his universe without him quite noticing the shift. "No," he admitted. "This is me realizing that I have been pretending to be alive for 7 years. And all of you, you make me want to actually live again." Keisha leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "That's the mushiest thing I've ever heard you say. I'm documenting this moment. Please don't." Too late. It's happening. 18 months after that first night at the Azure Pearl, Daesung's penthouse had undergone a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to its previous incarnation. The minimalist aesthetic had been compromised by the presence of 2 growing girls who treated his space like an extension of their own. There were sneakers by the door, half-finished homework on the dining table, and a science project taking up an entire corner of the living room that appeared to involve a disturbing amount of baking soda and food coloring. It was a Sunday morning, and Daesung was in the kitchen wearing an apron that said "World's Okayest Dad," a gift from the twins that he wore with confusing sincerity. He was attempting to make French toast, following a recipe on his tablet with the same intense focus he applied to business negotiations. The results were mixed. "You're burning it again," Tyla One observed from her perch at the kitchen island, swinging her legs. "I am not burning it, I am creating a caramelized exterior," Daesung argued, though smoke was definitely starting to rise from the pan. "Mom!" Tyla Two yelled toward the bedroom. "He's destroying breakfast again. We need intervention." Keisha emerged from the hallway, her hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of Daesung's shirts that fell to her knees. She kissed him on the cheek, deftly removed the smoking pan from the heat, and took over with practiced efficiency. "You manage international operations," she said fondly. "I'll manage the morning meal." Daesung stepped back, watching the 3 of them in the morning light, and felt the absence of his old life like a phantom limb. He didn't miss the silence anymore. He didn't miss the control. He wanted the chaos, the burnt French toast, the science projects that stained his marble floors. He wanted the noise. 3 years later, on a Tuesday evening, everything changed again. Daesung was in the middle of a particularly tense negotiation when his phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "We need to talk. Tonight. It's important." His blood ran cold. In his experience, those words never preceded good news. He ended the meeting early, ignored the protests from his team, and drove to her apartment with his mind racing through every worst-case scenario. When he arrived, Keisha was sitting on the couch, the twins nowhere in sight. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Where are the girls?" Daesung asked immediately. "Sleepover at their friend's house. I needed to talk to you alone." His tactical mind immediately assumed the worst. She was ending things. She'd realized what he really was, what he really did, and she was protecting her daughters. "I understand," he said stiffly, his defenses slamming back into place. "You don't need to explain. I will arrange for continued financial support and—" "I'm pregnant," Keisha interrupted. "The world." "Stop." Daesung stared at her, his brain refusing to process the information. "What?" "I'm pregnant. About 8 weeks. I know we never really talked about this, about expanding the family, and I know your life is complicated and this probably wasn't in your plans and I don't expect anything, but I thought you should." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His shoulders shook. It took her a moment to realize he was crying. "Daesung, I thought I would never get this again," he said, his voice breaking. "After I lost them, I thought this part of my life was over. That I didn't deserve it. That it was punishment for what I am." Keisha held him tighter. "You deserve this. You deserve all of this. You're a good man, Daesung. You're a good father. And you're going to be amazing with this baby too. I am terrified, he admitted. Good, she said. That means you care. That means you're going to try. 5 years after that first night, the Azure Pearl looked exactly the same. Same velvet darkness, same polished surfaces, same Monday evening crowd of people pretending to be more important than they were. But the corner booth that Dae-sung had claimed as his territory for so long was different now. It was occupied by 5 people instead of 1. Dae-sung sat in his familiar spot, though his temples were now touched with distinguished gray, and there was a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Across from him, Tyla 1 and Tyla 2 were 14 now, absorbed in a debate about college applications and career trajectories that made him both proud and anxious. Keisha sat beside him, her hand resting comfortably on his knee under the table, while between them in a high chair was the newest addition to their family. Minjun was 2 years old, possessing his father's serious expression and his mother's infectious laugh. He was currently very focused on destroying a bread roll with impressive efficiency. I'm just saying, Tyla 1 argued, that architecture is a perfectly valid career path that combines art and mathematics. You said valid career path, Dae-sung observed, lifting his water glass. That is not the same as strategic career path. Architecture requires years of education, substantial debt, and offers limited return on investment. You literally bought a building last month just because you liked the design, Tyla 2 pointed out. That's different. That's investment diversification. That's you being a hypocrite. Minjun threw his bread roll, and it landed perfectly in Dae-sung's water glass with a small splash. The girls dissolved into giggles. Keisha tried to look stern and failed completely. Your son has your aim, she observed. That's concerning, Dae-sung said, fishing the bread out of his water. But impressive. He looked around the table, at this family he'd somehow acquired through an act of desperation and improvisation 5 years ago, and felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that he'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He placed it on the table in front of Keisha. The ambient noise of the lounge seemed to fade, or maybe that was just his perception narrowing to this single moment. We have been operating under an informal arrangement for 5 years, Dae-sung said, his voice steady but lower than usual. The initial agreement was for 30 minutes. I believe we have significantly exceeded the terms. Keisha stared at the box. The twins had stopped arguing, their eyes wide. Minjun chose this moment to grab for the box, and Dae-sung gently redirected his attention to a spoon. Is this a contract renegotiation? Keisha asked, her voice trembling slightly. No, Dae-sung said, reaching out to cover her hand with his. This is a permanent merger. I am tired of the informal arrangement, Keisha. I want to make this official. I want the legal documentation that proves you are all mine and I am yours. He opened the box. The ring inside was perfect, a subtle design that balanced elegance with practicality, because Keisha was a woman who actually used her hands and needed jewelry that wouldn't interfere. Will you marry me? The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, empty silence of a man sitting alone anymore. It was the suspended, breathless silence of a future being written in real time. Keisha didn't answer immediately. She looked at the ring, then at her daughters, then at the small boy who was now trying to eat the spoon. Then she looked at Dae-sung, really looked at him, seeing everything he was and everything he'd become. Yes, she said simply. Obviously yes. She leaned over and kissed him, and across the table the twins exchanged satisfied looks. Finally, Tyla 1 whispered. We've been planning this since we were 9. The long game, Tyla 2 agreed. Totally worth it. Dae-sung broke the kiss and looked at his daughters. I know, he said, a genuine smile transforming his entire face. I have known for years that I was being strategically maneuvered. I simply needed to ensure I was worthy of being permanently acquired. And, Tyla 1 challenged. Are you? He looked at Keisha, at the ring now on her finger, at Minjun who was trying to grab his water glass again, at these 2 brilliant girls who'd seen something in him 5 years ago that he couldn't see in himself. I am working on it, he said. Every single day. And I will continue to work on it for the rest of my life. Good answer, Keisha said, kissing him again. And in that corner booth at the Azure Pearl, a man who'd been dead for 7 years finally completely came back to life. Not because he'd been rescued or redeemed, but because 2 9-year-old girls had decided he looked like he needed a father to play, and in doing so had given him a reason to be one.